47. More tales of the wheel. An itchy restlessness had Rand pacing beside the dining table. 12 strides. The table was exactly 12 strides long, no matter how many times he stepped it off. Irritably, he made himself stop keeping tally. Stupid thing to be doing. I don't care how long the bloody table is. A few minutes later, he discovered that he was counting the number of trips he made up the table and back. What is he saying to Moraine and Lan? Does he know why the Dark One is after us? Does he know which of us the Dark One wants? He glanced at his friends. Perrin had crumbled a piece of bread and was idly pushing the crumbs around on the table with one finger. His yellow eyes stared unblinking at the crumbs, but they seemed to see something far off. Matt slouched in his chair, eyes half closed, and the beginnings of a grin on his face. It was a nervous grin, not amusement. Outwardly he looked like the old Matt, but from time to time he unconsciously touched the Shadar Lagoth dagger through his coat. What is Fane telling her? What does he know? Loyal, at least, did not look worried. The Ogier was studying the walls. First he had stood in the middle of the room and stared, turning slowly in a circle. Now he was almost pressing his broad nose against the stone while he gently traced a particular join with fingers thicker than most men's thumbs. Sometimes he closed his eyes, as if the feeling was more important than seeing. His ears gave an occasional twitch, and he muttered to himself in Ogier, appearing to have forgotten anyone else was in the room with him. Lord Argomar stood talking quietly with Nynaeve and Egwene in front of the long fireplace at the end of the room. He was a good host, adept at making people forget their troubles. Several of his stories had Egwene in giggles. Once even Nynaeve threw back her head and roared with laughter. Rand gave a start at the unexpected sound and jumped again when Matt's chair crashed to the floor. "Blood and ashes!" Matt growled, ignoring the way Nynaeve's mouth tightened at his language. "What's taking her so long?" He righted his chair and sat back down without looking at anyone. His hand strayed to his coat. The Lord of Faldara looked at Matt disapprovingly. His gaze took in Rand and Perrin without any improvement, then turned back to the women. Rand's pacing had taken him close to them. "My lord," Egwene was saying, as glibly as if she had been using titles all of her life. "I thought he was a warder, but you call him Dai Shan and talk about a golden crane banner, and so do those other men. Sometimes you sound almost as if he's a king. I remember once Moraine called him the last lord of the Seven Towers. Who is he?" Nynaeve began studying her cup intently, but it was obvious to Rand that abruptly she was listening even more closely than was Egwene. Rand stopped and tried to overhear without seeming to eavesdrop. "Lord of the Seven Towers," Agomar said with a frown. "An ancient title, Lady Egwene. Not even the High Lords of Tyr have older, though the Queen of Andor comes close." He heaved a sigh and shook his head. "He will not speak of it, yet the story is well known along the border. He is a king, or should have been, Alan Mandragoran, Lord of the Seven Towers, Lord of the Lakes, crownless king of the Malkiari." His shaven head lifted high, and there was a light in his eye as if he felt a father's pride. His voice grew stronger, filled with the force of his feeling. The whole room could hear without straining. "We of Shinar call ourselves bordermen, but fewer than 50 years ago, Shinar was not truly of the borderlands. North of us and Oarafel was Malkier. The Lancers of Shinar rode north, but it was Malkier that held back the Blight. Malkier, peace favor her memory, and the light illumine her name." "Lan is from Malkier," the wisdom said softly, looking up. She seemed troubled. It was not a question, but Agomar nodded. "Yes, Lady Nynaeve. He is the son of Alakir Mandragoran, last crowned king of the Malkieri. How did he become as he is? The beginning perhaps was Lane. On a dare, Lane Mandragoran, the king's brother, led his lances through the Blight to the Blasted Lands, perhaps to Sheol Ghul itself. Lane's wife, Breann, made that dare for the envy that burned her heart that Alakir had been raised to the throne instead of Lane. The king and Lane were as close as brothers could be, as close as twins even after the royal Al was added to Akir's name, but jealousy racked Breann. Lane was acclaimed for his deeds, and rightfully so, but not even he could outshine Alakir. He was man and king, such as comes once in 100 years, if that. Peace favor him and Eliana. Lane died in the Blasted Lands with most of those who followed him, men Malkia could ill afford to lose, and Breann blamed the king, saying that Sheol Ghul itself would have fallen if Alakir had led the rest of the Malkieri north with her husband. For revenge, she plotted with Coin Gamalan, called Coin Fairheart, to seize the throne for her son, Isam. Now, Fairheart was a hero almost as well loved as Alakir himself, and one of the Great Lords. But when the Great Lords had cast the rods for king, only two separated him from Akir, and he never forgot that two men laying a different color on the crowning stone would have set him on the throne instead. Between them, Coin and Breann moved soldiers back from the Blight to seize the Seven Towers, stripping the border forts to bare garrisons. But Coin's jealousy ran deeper. Disgust tinged Agilmar's voice. Fairheart, the hero, whose exploits in the Blight were sung throughout the Borderlands, was a dark friend. With the border forts weakened, Trollocs poured into Malkier like a flood. King Alakir and Lane together might have rallied the land. They had done so before. But Lane's doom in the Blasted Lands had shaken the people, and the Trolloc invasion broke men's spirit and their will to resist. Too many men, overwhelming numbers, pushed the Malkieri back into the Heartland. Breann fled with her infant son, Isam, and was run down by Trollocs as she rode south with him. No one knows their fate for a certainty, but it can be guessed. I can find pity only for the boy. When Coin Fairheart's treachery was revealed, and he was taken by young Jane Charin, already called Jane Fastrider, when Fairheart was brought to the Seven Towers in chains, the Great Lords called for his head on a pike. But because he had been second only to Alakir and Lane in the hearts of the people, the king faced him in single combat and slew him. Alakir wept when he killed Coin. Some say he wept for a friend who had given himself to the shadow, and some say for Malkier. The Lord of Valdara shook his head sadly. The first peal of the doom of the Seven Towers had been struck. There was no time to gather aid from Shinar or Arafel, and no hope that Malkier could stand alone. With 5,000 of her lances dead in the Blasted Lands, her border forts overrun. Alakir and his queen Eliana had Lan brought to them in his cradle. Into his infant hands they placed the sword of Malkieri kings, the sword he wears today. A weapon made by Aes Sedai during the War of Power, the War of the Shadow that brought down the Age of Legends. They anointed his head with oil, naming him Daishan, a diademed battle lord, and consecrated him as the next king of the Malkieri. And in his name, they swore the ancient oath of Malkieri kings and queens. Agilmar's face hardened, and he spoke the words as if he too had sworn that oath, or one much similar. to stand against the shadow so long as iron is hard and stone abides, to defend the Malkieri while one drop of blood remains, to avenge what cannot be defended. The words rang in the chamber. Eliana placed a locket around her son's neck for remembrance, and the infant wrapped in swaddling clothes by the queen's own hand was given over to 20 chosen from the king's bodyguard, the best swordsmen, the most deadly fighters. Their command, to carry the child to Falmoran. Then did Alakir and Eliana lead the Malkieri out to face the shadow one last time. There they died, at Herod's crossing, and the Malkieri died, and the 7 towers were broken. Shinar and Arafel and Kandor met the Half-men and the Trollocs at the stair of Jehan, and threw them back, but not as far as they had been. Most of Malkier remained in Trolloc hands, and year by year, mile by mile, the Blight has swallowed it. Agumar drew a heavy-hearted breath. When he went on, there was a sad pride in his eyes and voice. Only 5 of the bodyguards reached Falmoran alive. Every man wounded, but they had the child unharmed. From the cradle, they taught him all they knew. He learned weapons as other children learned toys, and the Blight as other children their mother's garden. The oath sworn over his cradle is graven in his mind. There is nothing left to defend, but he can avenge. He denies his titles, yet in the Borderlands he is called the Uncrowned, and if ever he raised the golden crane of Malkier, an army would come to follow. But he will not lead men to their deaths. In the Blight, he courts death as a suitor courts a maiden, but he will not lead others to it. If you must enter the Blight, and with only a few, there is no man better to take you there, nor to bring you safely out again. He is the best of the warders, and that means the best of the best. You might as well leave these boys here to gain a little seasoning and put your entire trust in Lan. The Blight is no place for untried boys. Matt opened his mouth and shut it again at a look from Rand. I wish he'd learned to keep it shut. Nynaeve had listened just as wide-eyed as Egwene, but now she was staring into her cup again, her face pale. Egwene put a hand on her arm and gave her a sympathetic look. Moraine appeared in the doorway, Lan at her heels. Nynaeve turned her back on them. What did he say? Rand demanded. Matt rose, and Perrin too. Country oaf, Agumar muttered, then raised his voice to a normal tone. Did you learn anything, Aes Sedai? Or is he simply a madman? He is mad, Moraine said, or close to it. But there is nothing simple about Padan Fain. One of the black and gold liveried servants bowed his way in with a blue wash basin and pitcher, a bar of yellow soap, and a small towel on a silver tray. He looked anxiously at Agumar. Moraine directed him to put them on the table. Your pardon for commanding your servants, Lord Agumar, she said. I took the liberty of asking for this. Agumar nodded to the servant, who put the tray on the table and left hurriedly. My servants are yours to command, Aes Sedai. The water Moraine poured into the basin steamed as if only just off the boil. She pushed up her sleeves and began vigorously washing her hands without regard for the heat of the water. I said he was worse than vile, but I did not come close. I do not believe I have ever met someone so abject and debased, yet at the same time so foul. I feel soiled from touching him, and I do not mean for the filth on his skin. Soiled in here. She touched her breast. The degradation of his soul almost makes me doubt he has one. There is something worse to him than a dark friend. He looked so pitiful, Egwene murmured. I remember him arriving in Emond's Field each spring, always laughing and full of news from outside. Surely there's some hope for him. No man can stand in the shadow so long that he cannot find the light again, she quoted. The Aes Sedai toweled her hands briskly. I have always believed it so, she said. Perhaps Padan Fain can be redeemed, but he has been a dark friend more than 40 years, and what he has done for that, in blood and pain and death, would freeze your heart to hear. Among the least of these, though not small to you, I suspect, he brought the Trollocs to Emond's Field. Yes, Rand said softly. He heard Egwene gasp. I should have guessed. Burn me, I should have as soon as I recognized him. Did he bring any here? Matt asked. He looked at the stone walls around them and shivered. Rand thought he was remembering the Myrddraal more than Trollocs. Walls had not stopped the Fade at Baerlon, or at Whitebridge. If he did, Ogilmar laughed, they'll break their teeth on the walls of Faldara. Many others have before. He was speaking to everyone, but obviously addressing his words to Egwene and Nynaeve from the glances he gave them. And do not worry yourself about half-men either. Matt's face reddened. Every street and alley in Faldara is lit by night, and no man may hide his face inside the walls. Why would Master Fain do that? Egwene asked. 3 years ago. With a heavy sigh, Moraine sat down, folding up as if what she had done with Fain had drained her. 3 years this summer, as far back as that. The light surely favors us, else the father of lies would have triumphed while I still sat planning in Tar Valon. 3 years Fain has been hunting you for the Dark One. That's crazy, Rand said. He's come into the Two Rivers every spring as regular as a clock. 3 years. We've been right there in front of him, and he never looked at any of us twice before last year. The Aes Sedai pointed a finger at him, fixing him. Fain told me everything, Rand. Or almost everything. I believe he managed to hold back something important, despite all I could do, but he said enough. 3 years ago, a half-man came for him in a town in Morandi. Fain was terrified, of course, but it is considered a very great honor among dark friends to be so summoned. Fain believed he had been chosen for great things, and he had, though not in the manner he believed. He was brought north to the Blight, to the Blasted Lands, to Sheol Ghul, where he met a man with eyes of fire, who named himself Ba'alzamon. Matt shifted uneasily, and Rand swallowed hard. It had to have been that way, of course, but that did not make it any easier to accept. Only Perrin looked at the Aes Sedai as if nothing could surprise him any longer. The light protect us, Ogilmar said fervently. Fain did not like what was done to him at Sheol Ghul, Moraine continued calmly. While we talked, he screamed often of fire and burning. It almost killed him, bringing it all out from where he had it hidden. Even with my healing, he is a shattered ruin. It will take much to make him whole again. I will make the effort, though, if for no other reason than to learn what more he still hides. He had been chosen because of where he did his peddling. No, she said quickly when they stirred. Not the Two Rivers only. Not then. The Father of Lies knew roughly where to find what he sought, but not much better than we in Tar Valon. Fain said he has been made the Dark One's hound, and in a way he is right. The Father of Lies set Fain to hunt, first changing him so he could carry out that hunt. It is the things done to bring about those changes that Fain fears to remember. He hates his master for them as much as he fears him. So Fain was sent sniffing and hunting through all the villages around Baerlon and all the way to the Mountains of Mist and down to the Tyran and across into the Two Rivers. 3 springs ago, Perrin said slowly. I remember that spring. Fain came later than usual, but what was strange was that he lingered on. A whole week he remained, idle and gnashing his teeth about laying out money for a room at the Winespring Inn. Fain likes his money. I remember now, Matt said. Everybody was wondering, was he sick, or had he fallen for a local woman? Not that any of them would marry a peddler, of course. As well marry one of the travelling people. Egwene raised an eyebrow at him, and he shut his mouth. After that, Fane was taken to Sheol Ghul again, and his mind was distilled. Rand's stomach turned over at the tone in the Aes Sedai's voice. It told more of what she meant than the grimace that flashed across her face. What he had sensed was concentrated and fed back. When he entered the Two Rivers the next year, he was able to choose his targets out more clearly. Indeed, more clearly even than the Dark One had expected. Fane knew for a certainty that the one he sought was one of 3 in Emond's Field. Perrin grunted, and Mat began cursing in a soft monotone that even Nynaeve's blare did not stop. Argylmar looked at them curiously. Rand felt only the faintest chill, and wondered at it. 3 years the Dark One had been hunting him, hunting them. He was sure it should have made his teeth chatter. Moraine did not allow Mat to interrupt her. She raised her voice enough to be heard over him. When Fane returned to Lugard, Baalzamon came to him in a dream. Fane abased himself and performed rites that would strike you deaf to hear the half of them, binding himself even more tightly to the Dark One. What is done in dreams can be more dangerous than what is done awake. Rand stirred at the sharp, warning look, but she did not pause. He was promised great rewards, power over kingdoms after Baalzamon's victory, and told that when he returned to Emond's Field, he was to mark the 3 he had found. A half-man would be there waiting for him with Trollocs. We know now how the Trollocs came to the Two Rivers. There must have been an Ogier grove and a waygate at Manetheren.
The most beautiful of all, Loyal said, except for Tar Valon.
He had been listening as intently as everyone else.
Manetheren is remembered fondly by the Ogier.
Argylmar formed the name silently, his eyebrows raised in wonder. Manetheren. Lord Argylmar, Moraine said, I will tell you how to find the waygate of Marfal de Daranel. It must be walled up and a guard set, and none allowed near. The half-men have not learned all of the ways yet, but that waygate is to the south, and only hours from Faldara. The Lord of Faldara gave himself a shake, as if he were coming out of a trance. South? Peace? We don't need that, the light shine on us. It shall be done.
Did Fane follow us through the ways?
Perrin asked.
He must have done.
Moraine nodded. Fane would follow you 3 into the grave, because he must. When the Myrddraal failed at Emond's Field, it brought Fane with the Trollocs on our trail. The Fade would not let Fane ride with him, although he thought he should have the best horse in the Two Rivers and ride at the head of the band. The Myrddraal forced him to run with the Trollocs, and the Trollocs to carry him when his feet gave out. They talked so that he could understand, arguing about the best way to cook him when his usefulness was done. Fane claims he turned against the Dark One before they reached the Turren, but sometimes his greed for his promised rewards seeps into the open. When we had escaped across the Tarren, the Myrddraal took the Trollocs back to the closest waygate in the Mountains of Mist and sent Fane across alone. He thought he was free then, but before he reached Baerlon, another Fade found him, and that one was not so kind. It made him sleep doubled up on himself in a Trolloc kettle at night to remind him of the price of failure. That one used him as far as Shadar Logoth. By then, Fane was willing to give the Myrddraal his mother if it would free him, but the Dark One never willingly loosens a hold he has gained. What I did there, sending an illusion of our tracks and smell off toward the mountains, fooled the Myrddraal, but not Fane. The half-men did not believe him. Afterward, they dragged him behind them on a leash. Only when we seemed to keep always just ahead, no matter how hard they pressed, did some begin to credit him. Those were the 4 who returned to Shadar Lagos. Fane claims it was Ba'alzamon himself who drove the Murdral. Agilmar shook his head contemptuously. The Dark One? Pah! The man's lying or mad. If Heartsbane were loose, we'd all of us be dead by now, or worse. Fane spoke the truth as he saw it, Moraine said. He could not lie to me, though he hid much. His words. Ba'alzamon appeared like a flickering candle flame, vanishing and reappearing, never in the same place twice. His eyes seared the Murdral, and the fires of his mouth scourged us. Something, Lan said, drove 4 Fades to where they feared to go. A place they fear almost as much as they fear the wrath of the Dark One. Agilmar grunted as if he had been kicked. He looked sick. It was evil against evil in the ruins of Shadar Lagos, Moraine continued, foul fighting vile. When Fane spoke of it, his teeth chattered and he whimpered. Many Trollocs were slain, consumed by Mashadar and other things, including the Trolloc that held Fane's leash. He fled the city as if it were the pit of doom at Sheol Ghul. Fane believed he was free at last. He intended to run until Ba'alzamon could never find him again, to the ends of the earth if necessary. Imagine his horror when he discovered that the compulsion to hunt did not lessen. Instead, it grew stronger and sharper with every day that passed. He could not eat, except what he could scavenge while he hunted you. Beetles and lizards snatched while he ran, half-rotten refuse dug from midden heaps in the dark of night. Nor could he stop until exhaustion collapsed him like an empty sack. And as soon as he had strength to stand again, he was driven on. By the time he reached Camelin, he could feel his quarry even when it was a mile away. Here, in the cells below, he would sometimes look up, without realizing what he was doing. He was looking in the direction of this room. Rand had a sudden itch between his shoulder blades. It was as if he could feel Fane's eyes on him then, through the intervening stone. The Aes Sedai noticed his uneasy shrug, but she went on implacably. If Fane was half mad by the time he reached Camelin, he sank even further when he realized that only 2 of those he sought were there. He was compelled to find all of you, but he could do no other than follow the 2 who were there, either. He spoke of screaming when the Waygate opened in Camelin. The knowledge of how to do it was in his mind. He does not know how it came there. His hands moved of their own accord, burning with the fires of Ba'alzamon when he tried to stop them. The owner of the shop, who came to investigate the noise, Fane murdered. Not because he had to, but out of envy that the man could walk freely out of the cellar while his feet carried him inexorably into the ways. Then Fane was the one you sensed following us, Egwene said. Lan nodded. How did he escape the Black Wind? Her voice shook. She stopped to swallow. It was right behind us at the Waygate. He escaped, and he did not, Moraine said. The Black Wind caught him, and he claimed to understand the voices. Some greeted him as like to them, others feared him. No sooner did the wind envelop Fane than it fled.
The light preserve us.
Loyal's whisper rumbled like a giant bumblebee. Pray that it does, Moraine said. There is much yet hidden about Padan Fane, much I must learn. The evil goes deeper in him and stronger than in any man I have yet seen. It may be that the Dark One, in doing what he did to Fane, impressed some part of himself on the man, perhaps even, unknowing, some part of his intent. When I mentioned the Eye of the World, Fane clumped his jaws shut, but I felt something. Knowing behind the silence. If only I had the time now. But we cannot wait.
If this man knows something,
Agilmar said,
I can get it out of him.
His face held no mercy for dark friends. His voice promised no pity for Fane.
"If you can learn even a part of what you will face in the Blight, it's worth an extra day. Battles have been lost for not knowing what the enemy intends."
Moraine sighed and shook her head ruefully. "My lord, if we did not need at least one good night's sleep before facing the Blight, I would ride within the hour, though it meant the risk of meeting a Trolloc raid in the dark. Consider what I did learn from Fane. 3 years ago, the Dark One had to have Fane brought to Shael Ghul to touch him, despite the fact that Fane is a Dark Friend dedicated to his marrow. 1 year ago, the Dark One could command Fane, the Dark Friend, through his dreams. This year, Ba'alzamon walks in the dreams of those who live in the light, and actually appears, if with difficulty, at Shadar Logoth. Not in his own body, of course, but even a projection of the Dark One's mind, even a projection that flickers and cannot hold, is more deathly dangerous to the world than all the Trolloc hordes combined. The seals on Shael Ghul are weakening desperately, Lord Agilmar. There is no time." Agilmar bowed his head in acquiescence, but when he raised it again, there was still a stubborn set to his mouth.
"Aes Sedai, I can accept that when I lead the Lancers to Tarwin's Gap, we will be no more than a diversion, or a skirmish on the outskirts of the real battle. Duty takes men where it will, as surely as does the pattern, and neither promises that what we do will have greatness. But our skirmish will be useless, even should we win, if you lose the battle. If you say your party must be small, I say well and good, but I beg you to make every effort to see that you can win. Leave these young men here, Aes Sedai. I swear to you that I can find 3 experienced men with no thought of glory in their heads to replace them. Good swordsmen who are almost as handy in the Blight as Lan. Let me ride to the Gap, knowing that I have done what I can to help you be victorious."
"I must take them, and no others, Lord Agilmar," Moraine said gently. "They are the ones who will fight the battle at the Eye of the World." Agilmar's jaw dropped, and he stared at Rand and Mat and Perrin. Suddenly, the Lord of Faldara took a step back, his hand groping unconsciously for the sword he never wore inside the fortress.
"They aren't. You are not Red Aja, Moraine Sedai, but surely not even you would..."
Sudden sweat glistened on his shaven head. "They are ta'veren," Moraine said soothingly. "The pattern weaves itself around them. Already the Dark One has tried to kill each of them more than once. 3 ta'veren in one place are enough to change the life around them as surely as a whirlpool changes the path of a straw. When the place is the Eye of the World, the pattern might weave even the Father of Lies into itself and make him harmless again." Agilmar stopped trying to find his sword, but he still looked at Rand and the others doubtfully.
"Moraine Sedai, if you say they are, then they are, but I cannot see it. Farm boys, are you certain, Aes Sedai?"
"The old blood," Moraine said, "split out like a river breaking into 1,000 times 1,000 streams, but sometimes streams join together to make a river again. The old blood of Manetheren is strong and pure in almost all these young men. Can you doubt the strength of Manetheren's blood, Lord Agilmar?" Rand glanced sideways at the Aes Sedai. "Almost all." He risked a look at Nynaeve. She had turned back to watch as well as listen, though she still avoided looking at Lan. He caught the Wisdom's eye. She shook her head. She had not told the Aes Sedai that he was not 2 rivers born. What does Moraine know?
"Manetheren,"
Agilmar said slowly, nodding.
"I would not doubt that blood.
Then, more quickly,
The wheel brings strange times. Farm boys carry the honor of Manetheren into the Blight. Yet if any blood can strike a fell blow at the Dark One, it would be the blood of Manetheren. It shall be done as you wish, Aes Sedai.
Then let us go to our rooms, Moraine said. We must leave with the sun, for time grows short. The young men must sleep close to me. Time is too short before the battle to allow the Dark One another strike at them. Too short. Rand felt her eyes on him, studying him and his friends, weighing their strength, and he shivered. Too short. Chapter 48. The Blight. The wind whipped Lan's cloak, sometimes making him hard to see even in the sunlight. And Ingtar and the 100 lances Lord Argylmar had sent to escort them to the border in case they met a Trolloc raid made a brave display in double column with their armor and their red pennants and their steel-clad horses, led by Ingtar's grey owl banner. They were easily as grand as 100 of the Queen's guards, but it was the towers just in sight ahead of them that Rand studied. He had had all morning to watch the Shienaran lances. Each tower stood tall and solid atop a hill, half a mile from its neighbor. East and west others rose, and more beyond those. A broad walled ramp spiraled around each stone shaft, winding all the way around by the time it reached the heavy gates halfway to the crenellated top. A sortie from the garrison would be protected by the wall until it reached the ground, but enemies striving to reach the gate would climb under a hail of arrows and stones and hot oil from the big kettles poised on the outward flaring ramparts above. A large steel mirror, carefully turned down, away from the sun now, glittered atop each tower below the high iron cup where signal fires could be lit when the sun did not shine. The signal would be flashed to towers further from the border, and by those to still others, and so relayed to the heartland fortresses, from where the lances would ride to turn back the raid. Were times normal, they would. From the two nearest tower tops, men watched them approach, just a few men on each, peering curiously through the crenels. In the best of times, the towers were only manned enough for self-defense, depending more on stone walls than strong arms to survive, but every man who could be spared, and more, was riding to Tarwin's Gap. The fall of the towers would not matter if the lances failed to hold the gap. Rand shivered as they rode between the towers. It was almost as if he had ridden through a wall of colder air. This was the border. The land beyond looked no different from Shienar, but out there, somewhere beyond the leafless trees, was the Blight. Ingtar lifted a steel fist to halt the lances short of a plain stone post in sight of the towers. A border post, marking the boundary between Shienar and what once was Malkier.
Your pardon, Moraine Aes Sedai. Pardon, Daishan. Pardon, Builder. Lord Argylmar commanded me to go no further.
He sounded unhappy about it, disgruntled at life in general. That is as we planned, Lord Argylmar and I, Moraine said.
Ingtar grunted sourly. Pardon, Aes Sedai.
He apologized, not sounding as if he meant it.
To escort you here means we may not reach the gap before the fighting is done. I am robbed of the chance to stand with the rest, and at the same time, I am commanded not to ride one step beyond the border post, as if I had never before been in the Blight. And my Lord Argylmar will not tell me why.
Behind the bars of his face guard, his eyes turned the last word into a question to the Aes Sedai. He scorned to look at Rand and the others. He had learned they would accompany Lan into the Blight.
He can have my place,
Mat muttered to Rand. Lan gave them both a sharp look. Mat dropped his eyes, his face turning red. Each of us has his part in the pattern, Ingtar, Moraine said firmly. From here, we must thread ours alone. Ingtar's bow was stiffer than his armor made it. As you wish it, Aes Sedai. I must leave you now and ride hard in order to reach Tarwin's Gap. At least I will be allowed to face Trollocs there. Are you truly that eager? Nynaeve asked. To fight Trollocs? Ingtar gave her a puzzled look, then glanced at Lan as if the warder might explain. That is what I do, lady, he said slowly. That is why I am. He raised a gauntleted hand to Lan, open palm toward the warder. Suravie nintoman shima taishite daishan. Peace favor your sword. Pulling his horse around, Ingtar rode east with his bannerman and his 100 lancers. They went at a walk, but a steady pace, as fast as armored horses could manage with a far distance yet to go. What a strange thing to say, Egwene said. Why did they use it like that? Peace. When you have never known a thing except to dream, Lan replied, heeling Mandab forward, it becomes more than a talisman. As Rand followed the warder past the stone border post, he turned in his saddle to look back, watching Ingtar and the lancers disappear behind barren trees, and the border post vanish, and last of all the towers on their hilltops, looking over the trees. All too soon they were alone, riding north under the leafless canopy of the forest. Rand sank into watchful silence, and for once even Mat had nothing to say. That morning, the gates of Faldara had opened with the dawn. Lord Agilmar, armored and helmeted now like his soldiers, rode with the Black Hawk banner and the 3 foxes from the east gate toward the sun, still only a red sliver above the trees. Like a steel snake undulating to mounted kettle drums, the column wound its way out of the town 4 abreast, Agilmar at its head hidden in the forest, before its tail left Faldara Keep. There were no cheers in the streets to speed them on their way, only their own drums and their pennants cracking in the wind, but their eyes looked toward the rising sun with purpose. Eastward they would join other steel serpents from Fal Moran, behind King Iasar himself with his sons at his side, and from Angkor Dale that held the eastern marches and guarded the spine of the world, from Mos Shirare and Fal Sion and Camron Ka'an, and all the other fortresses in Shinar, great and small. Joined into a greater serpent, they would turn north to Tarwin's Gap. Another exodus had begun at the same time, using the King's Gate that led out on the way to Fal Moran. Carts and wagons, people mounted and people afoot, driving their livestock, carrying children on their backs, faces as long as the morning shadows. Reluctance to leave their homes, perhaps forever, slowed their feet, yet fear of what was coming spurred them, so that they went in bursts, feet dragging, then breaking into a run for a dozen paces, only to fall back once more, to shuffling through the dust. A few paused outside the town to watch the soldiers' armored line winding into the forest. Hope blossomed in some eyes, and prayers were muttered. Prayers for the soldiers, prayers for themselves, before they turned south again, trudging. The smallest column went out of the Malkier Gate. Left behind were a few who would remain, soldiers and a sprinkling of older men, their wives dead and their grown children making the slow way south. A last handful, so that whatever happened in Tarwin's Gap, Faldara would not fall undefended. Ingtar's grey owl led the way, but it was Moraine who took them north, the most important column of all, and the most desperate. For at least an hour after they passed the border post, there was no change in land or forest. The warder kept them at a hard pace, as fast a walk as the horses could maintain, but Rand kept wondering when they would reach the Blight. The hills became a little higher, but the trees and the creepers and the underbrush were no different than what he had seen in Shinar, grey and all but leafless. He began to feel warmer. warm enough to sling his cloak across the pommel of his saddle. "This is the best weather we've seen all year," Egwene said, shrugging out of her own cloak. Nynaeve shook her head, frowning as if listening to the wind. "It feels wrong." Rand nodded. He could feel it too, though he could not say what it was exactly he was feeling. The wrongness went beyond the first warmth he could remember out of doors this year. It was more than the simple fact that it should not be so warm this far north. It must be the Blight. But the land was the same. The sun climbed high, a red ball that could not give so much warmth despite the cloudless sky. A little while later, he unbuttoned his coat. Sweat trickled down his face. He was not the only one. Matt took his coat off, openly displaying the gold and ruby dagger, and wiped his face with the end of his scarf. Blinking, he rewound the scarf into a narrow band low over his eyes. Nynaeve and Egwene fanned themselves. They rode slumped as if they were wilting. Loial undid his high-collared tunic all the way down, and his shirt as well. The Ogier had a narrow strip of hair up the middle of his chest, as thick as fur. He muttered apologies all around.
"You must forgive me. Steading Shanghai is in the mountains and cool."
His broad nostrils flared, drawing in air that was becoming warmer by the minute.
"I don't like this heat and damp."
It was damp, Rand realized. It felt like the mire in the depths of summer back in the Two Rivers. In that boggy swamp, every breath came as if through a wool blanket soaked in hot water. There was no soggy ground here, only a few ponds and streams, trickles to someone used to the waterwood, but the air was like that in the mire. Only Perrin, still in his coat, was breathing easily. Perrin and the warder. There were a few leaves now, on trees that were not evergreen. Rand reached out to touch a branch and stopped, with his hand short of the leaves. Sickly yellow mottled the red of the new growth, and black flecks like disease. "I told you not to touch anything." The warder's voice was flat. He still wore his shifting cloak, as if heat made no more impression on him than cold. It almost made his angular face seem to float unsupported above Mandarb's back. "Flowers can kill in the Blight, and leaves maim. There's a little thing called a stick that likes to hide where the leaves are thickest, looking like its name, waiting for something to touch it. When something does, it bites. Not poison. The juice begins to digest the stick's prey for it. The only thing that can save you is to cut off the arm or leg that was bitten. But a stick won't bite unless you touch it. Other things in the Blight will." Rand jerked his hand back, leaves untouched, and wiped it on his pants leg. "Then we're in the Blight," Perrin said. Strangely, he did not sound frightened. "Just the fringe," Lan said grimly. His stallion kept moving forward, and he spoke over his shoulder. "The real Blight still lies ahead. There are things in the Blight that hunt by sound, and some may have wandered this far south. Sometimes they cross the mountains of doom. Much worse than sticks. Keep quiet and keep up if you want to stay alive." He continued to set a hard pace, not waiting for an answer. Mile by mile, the corruption of the Blight became more apparent. Leaves covered the trees in ever greater profusion, but stained and spotted with yellow and black, with livid red streaks like blood poisoning. Every leaf and creeper seemed bloated, ready to burst at a touch. Flowers hung on trees and weeds in a parody of spring, sickly pale and pulpy, waxen things that appeared to be rotting while Rand watched. When he breathed through his nose, the sweet stench of decay, heavy and thick, sickened him. When he tried breathing through his mouth, he almost gagged. The air tasted like a mouthful of spoiled meat. The horse's hooves made a soft squishing as rotten ripe things broke open under them. Matt leaned out of his saddle and spewed until his stomach was empty. Rand sought the void, but calmness was little help against the burning bile that kept creeping up his throat. Empty or not, Matt heaved again a mile later, bringing up nothing, and yet again after that. Egwene looked as if she wanted to be sick too, swallowing constantly, and Nynaeve's face was a white mask of determination, her jaw set and her eyes fixed on Moraine's back. The wisdom would not admit to feeling ill unless the Aes Sedai did first, but Rand did not think she would have to wait long. Moraine's eyes were tight, and her lips pale. Despite the heat and damp, Loial wrapped a scarf around his nose and mouth. When he met Rand's gaze, the Ogier's outrage and disgust were plain in his eyes.
"I had heard,"
he began, his voice muffled by the wool, then stopped to clear his throat with a grimace.
"Pho! It tastes like a... Pho! I had heard and read about the Blight, but nothing could describe..."
His gesture somehow took in the smell as well as the eye-sickening growth.
"That even the Dark One should do this to trees. Pho!"
The warder was not affected, of course. At least not that Rand could see, but to his surprise neither was Perrin, or rather not in the way the rest of them were. The big youth glared at the obscene forest through which they rode as he might have at an enemy, or the banner of an enemy. He caressed the axe at his belt as if unaware of what he was doing, and muttered to himself, half growling in a way that made the hair on Rand's neck stir. Even in full sunlight, his eyes glowed, golden and fierce. The heat did not abate as the bloody sun fell toward the horizon. In the distance, to the north, mountains rose, higher than the mountains of mist, black against the sky. Sometimes an icy wind from the sharp peaks gusted far enough to reach them. The torrid humidity leached away most of the mountain chill, but what remained was winter cold compared to the swelter it replaced, if just for a moment. The sweat on Rand's face seemed to flash into beads of ice. As the wind died, the beads melted again, running angry lines down his cheeks, and the thick heat returned harder than before by comparison. For the instant the wind surrounded them, it swept away the fetor, yet he would have done without that too if he could have. The cold was the chill of the grave, and it carried the dusty must of an old tomb newly opened. "We cannot reach the mountains by nightfall," Lan said, "and it is dangerous to move at night, even for a warder alone." "There is a place not far off," Moraine said. "It will be a good omen for us to camp there." The warder gave her a flat look, then nodded reluctantly. "Yes, we must camp somewhere. It might as well be there." "The eye of the world was beyond the high passes when I found it," Moraine said. "Better to cross the mountains of doom in full daylight, at noon, when the Dark One's powers in this world are weakest." "You talk as if the eye isn't always in the same place." Egwene spoke to the Aes Sedai, but it was Loial who answered.
"No two among the Ogier have found it in exactly the same place. The Green Man seems to be found where he is needed, but it has always been beyond the high passes. They are treacherous, the high passes, and haunted by creatures of the Dark One." "We must reach the passes before we need worry about them," Lan said. "Tomorrow we will be truly into the Blight." Brand looked at the forest around him, every leaf and flower diseased, every creeper decaying as it grew, and he could not repress a shudder. If this isn't truly the Blight, what is? Lan turned them westward, at an angle to the sinking sun. The warder maintained the pace he had set before, but there was reluctance in the set of his shoulders. The sun was a sullen red ball just touching the treetops when they crested a hill, and the warder drew rein. Beyond them, to the west, lay a network of lakes, the waters glittering darkly in the slanting sunlight, like beads of random size on a necklace of many strings. In the distance, circled by the lakes, stood jagged-topped hills, thick in the creeping shadows of evening.
For one brief instant, the sun's rays caught the shattered tops, and Rand's breath stilled. Not hills. The broken remnants of 7 towers. He was not sure if anyone else had seen it. The sight was gone as quickly as it came. The warder was dismounting, his face as lacking in emotion as a stone. "Couldn't we camp down by the lakes?" Nynaeve asked, patting her face with her kerchief. "It must be cooler down by the water." "Light," Matt said. "I'd just like to stick my head in one of them. I might never take it out." Just then, something roiled the waters of the nearest lake, the dark water phosphorescing as a huge body rolled beneath the surface. Length on man-thick length sent ripples spreading, rolling on and on until at last a tail rose, waving a point like a wasp's stinger for an instant in the twilight, at least 5 spans into the air. All along that length, fat tentacles writhed like monstrous worms, as many as a centipede's legs. It slid slowly beneath the surface and was gone, only the fading ripples to say it had ever been. Rand closed his mouth and exchanged a look with Perrin. Perrin's yellow eyes were as disbelieving as he knew his own must be. Nothing that big could live in a lake that size. Those couldn't have been hands on those tentacles. They couldn't have been. "On second thought," Matt said faintly, "I like it right here just fine." "I will set guarding wards around this hill," Moraine said. She had already dismounted from Aldib. "A true barrier would draw the attention we do not want like flies to honey, but if any creation of the Dark One or anything that serves the Shadow comes within a mile of us, I will know." "I'd be happier with the barrier," Matt said as his boots touched the ground, "just as long as it kept that thing on the other side." "Oh, do be quiet, Matt," Egwene said curtly, at the same time as Nynaeve spoke. "And have them waiting for us when we leave in the morning? You are a fool, Matron Cawthon." Matt glowered at the 2 women as they climbed down, but he kept his mouth shut. As he took Bella's reins, Rand shared a grin with Perrin. For a moment, it was almost like being home, having Matt saying what he should not at the worst possible time. Then the smile faded from Perrin's face. In the twilight, his eyes did glow, as if they had a yellow light behind them. Rand's grin slipped away too. It isn't like home at all. Rand and Matt and Perrin helped Lan unsaddle and hobble the horses, while the others began setting up the camp. Loyal muttered to himself as he set up the warder's tiny stove, but his thick fingers moved deftly. Egwene was humming as she filled the tea kettle from a bulging water bag. Rand no longer wondered why the warder had insisted on bringing so many full water skins. Setting the bay's saddle in line with the others, he unfastened his saddlebags and blanket roll from the cantle, turned, and stopped with a tingle of fear. The Ogier and the women were gone. So was the stove and all the wicker panniers from the pack-horse. The hilltop was empty, except for evening shadows. With a numb hand, he fumbled for his sword, dimly hearing Matt curse. Perrin had his axe out, his shaggy head swiveling to find the danger. "Sheep herders," Lan muttered. Unconcernedly, the warder strode across the hilltop, and at his 3rd step, he vanished. Rand exchanged wide-eyed looks with Matt and Perrin, and then they were all darting for where the warder had disappeared. Abruptly, Rand skidded to a halt, taking another step when Matt ran into his back. Egwene looked up from setting the kettle atop the tiny stove. Nynaeve was closing the mantle on a second lit lantern. They were all there, Moraine sitting cross-legged, Lan lounging on an elbow, Loyal taking a book out of his pack. Cautiously, Rand looked behind him. The hillside was there as it had been, the shadowed trees, the lakes beyond sinking into darkness. He was afraid to step back, afraid they would all disappear again, and perhaps this time he would not be able to find them. Edging carefully around him, Perrin let out a long breath. Moraine noticed the 3 of them standing there, gaping. Perrin looked abashed and slipped his axe back into the heavy belt loop as if he thought no one might notice. A smile touched her lips. "It is a simple thing," she said. "A bending, so any eye looking at us sees around us instead. We cannot have the eyes that will be out there seeing our lights tonight, and the Blight is no place to be in the dark." "Moraine Sedai says I might be able to do it." Egwene's eyes were bright. "She says I can handle enough of the One Power right now." "Not without training, child," Moraine cautioned. "The simplest matter concerning the One Power can be dangerous to the untrained, and to those around them." Perrin snorted, and Egwene looked so uncomfortable that Rand wondered if she had already been trying her abilities. Nynaeve set down the lantern. Together with the tiny flame of the stove, the pair of lanterns gave a generous light. "When you go to Tarvalon, Egwene," she said carefully, "perhaps I'll go with you." The look she gave Moraine was strangely defensive. It will do her good to see a familiar face among strangers. She'll need someone to advise her besides Aes Sedai. "Perhaps that would be for the best, Wisdom," Moraine said simply. Egwene laughed and clapped her hands. "Oh, that will be wonderful! And you, Rand, you'll come too, won't you?" He paused in the act of sitting across the stove from her, then slowly lowered himself. He thought her eyes had never been bigger, or brighter, or more like pools that he could lose himself in. Spots of colour appeared in her cheeks, and she gave a smaller laugh. "Perrin, Matt, you two will come, won't you? We'll all be together." Matt gave a grunt that could have signified anything, and Perrin only shrugged, but she took it for assent. "You see, Rand? We'll all be together." Light, but a man could drown in those eyes and be happy doing it. Embarrassed, he cleared his throat. "Do they have sheep in Tarvalon?" "That's all I know. Herding sheep and growing tobacco." "I believe," Moraine said, "that I can find something for you to do in Tarvalon. For all of you. Not herding sheep, perhaps, but something you will find interesting." "There," Egwene said, as if it was settled. "I know. I will make you my warder. When I'm on Aes Sedai. You would like being a warder, wouldn't you? My warder?" She sounded sure, but he saw the question in her eyes. She wanted an answer. Needed it. "I'd like being your warder," he said. "She's not for you, nor you for her. Why did Min have to tell me that?" Darkness came down heavily, and everyone was tired. Loyal was the first to roll over and ready himself for sleep, but others followed soon after. No one used their blankets, except for a pillow. Moraine had put something in the oil of the lamps that dispelled the stench of the blight from the hilltop, but nothing diminished the heat. The moon gave a wavering, watery light, but the sun might have been at its zenith for all the cool the night had. Rand found sleep impossible, even with the Aes Sedai stretched out not a span away to shield his dreams. It was the thick air that kept him awake. Loyal's soft snores were a rumble that made Perrin's seem non-existent, but they did not stop weariness from claiming the others. The warder was still awake, seated not far from him with his sword across his knees, watching the night. To Rand's surprise, so was Nynaeve. The Wisdom looked at Lan silently for a long time, then poured a cup of tea and brought it to him. When he reached out with a murmur of thanks, she did not let go right away. "I should have known you would be a king," she said quietly. Her eyes were steady on the warder's face, but her voice trembled slightly. Lan looked back at her just as intently. It seemed to Rand that the warder's face actually softened. "I am not a king, Nynaeve. Just a man. A man without as much to his name as even the meanest farmer's croft." Nynaeve's voice steadied. "Some women don't ask for land or gold. Just the man. And the man who would ask her to accept so little would not be worthy of her. You are a remarkable woman. As beautiful as the sunrise.
as fierce as a warrior. You are a lioness, Wisdom.
A wisdom seldom wets. She paused to take a deep breath, as if steeling herself. But if I go to Tarvalon, it may be that I will be something other than a wisdom.
Aes Sedai marry as seldom as wisdoms. Few men can live with so much power in a wife, dimming them by her radiance whether she wishes to or not.
Some men are strong enough. I know one such. If there could have been any doubt, her look left none as to whom she meant.
All I have is a sword, and a war I cannot win, but can never stop fighting.
I've told you I care nothing for that. Light, you've made me say more than is proper already. Will you shame me to the point of asking you?
I will never shame you.
The gentle tone, like a caress, sounded odd to Rand's ears in the warder's voice, but it made Nynaeve's eyes brighten.
I will hate the man you choose because he is not me, and love him if he makes you smile. No woman deserves the sure knowledge of widow's black as her bride price. You, least of all.
He set the untouched cup on the ground and rose.
I must check the horses.
Nynaeve remained there, kneeling after he had gone. Sleep or no, Rand closed his eyes. He did not think the wisdom would like it if he watched her cry. Chapter 49. The Dark One Stirs. Dawn woke Rand with a start, the sullen sun pricking his eyelids as it peeked reluctantly over the treetops of the Blight. Even so early, heat covered the spoiled lands in a heavy blanket. He lay on his back with his head pillowed on his blanket roll, staring at the sky. It was still blue, the sky. Even here, that, at least, was untouched. He was surprised to realize that he had slept. For a minute, the dim memory of a conversation overheard seemed like part of some dream. Then he saw Nynaeve's red-rimmed eyes. She had not slept, obviously. Lan's face was harder than ever, as if he had resumed a mask and did not intend to let it slip again. Egwene went over and crouched beside the wisdom, her face concerned. He could not make out what they said. Egwene spoke, and Nynaeve shook her head. Egwene said something else, and the wisdom waved her away dismissively. Instead of going, Egwene bent her head closer, and for a few minutes the two women talked even more softly, with Nynaeve still shaking her head. The wisdom ended it with a laugh, hugging Egwene and, by her expression, making soothing talk. When Egwene stood, though, she glared at the warder. Lan did not seem to notice. He did not look in Nynaeve's direction at all. Shaking his head, Rand gathered his things and gave his hands and face and teeth a hasty wash with the little water Lan allowed for such things. He wondered if women had a way of reading men's minds. It was an unsettling thought. All women are Aes Sedai. Telling himself he was letting the Blight get to him, he rinsed out his mouth and hurried to get the bay saddled. It was more than a little disconcerting, having the campsite disappear before he reached the horses, but by the time his saddle girth was tight, everything on the hill winked back into view. Everyone was hurrying. The 7 towers stood plain in the morning light, distant broken stumps, like huge rough hills that merely hinted at grandeur gone. The 100 lakes were a smooth, unruffled blue. Nothing broke the surface this morning. When he looked at the lakes and the ruined towers, he could almost ignore the sickly things growing around the hill. Lan did not seem to be avoiding looking at the towers, any more than he seemed to be avoiding Nynaeve, but somehow he never did as he concentrated on getting them ready to go. After the wicker panniers were fastened on the pack horse, after every scrap and smudge and track were gone and everyone else was mounted, the Aes Sedai stood in the middle of the hilltop with her eyes closed, not even seeming to breathe. Nothing happened that Rand could see, except that Nynaeve and Egwene shivered despite the heat and rubbed their arms briskly. Egwene's hands suddenly froze on her arms, and she opened her mouth, staring at the wisdom. Before she could speak, Nynaeve also ceased her rubbing and gave her a sharp look. The two women looked at one another, then Egwene nodded and grinned, and after a moment Nynaeve did too, though her smile was only half-hearted. Rand scrubbed his fingers through his hair, already more damp with sweat than with the water he had splashed in his face. He was sure there was something in the silent exchange that he should understand, but that feather-light brush across his mind vanished before he could grasp it. "What are we waiting for?" Mat demanded, the low band of his scarf across his forehead. He had his bow across the pommel of his saddle with an arrow nocked, and his quiver pulled around on his belt for an easy reach. Moraine opened her eyes and started down the hill. "For me to remove the last vestige of what I did here last night. The residues would have dissipated on their own in a day, but I will not take any risk I can avoid now. We are too close, and the shadow is too strong here. Lan?" The warder only waited for her to settle in Aldeeb's saddle before he led them north, toward the mountains of doom, looming in the near distance. Even under the sunrise, the peaks rose black and lifeless, like jagged teeth. In a wall they stretched, east and west as far as the eye could see. "Will we reach the Eye today, Moraine Sedai?" Egwene asked. The Aes Sedai gave Loial a sidelong look. "I hope that we will. When I found it before, it was just the other side of the mountains, at the foot of the high passes." "He says it moves," Mat said, nodding at Loial. "What if it isn't where you expect?" "Then we will continue to hunt until we do find it. The green man senses need, and there can be no need greater than ours. Our need is the hope of the world." As the mountains grew closer, so did the true Blight. Where a leaf had been spotted black and mottled yellow before, now foliage fell wetly while he watched, breaking apart from the weight of its own corruption. The trees themselves were tortured, crippled things, twisted branches clawing at the sky as if begging mercy from some power that refused to hear. Ooze slid like pus from bark cracked and split. As if nothing truly solid was left to them, the trees seemed to tremble from the passage of the horses over the ground. "Look as if they want to grab us," Mat said nervously. Nynaeve gave him an exasperated, scornful look, and he added fiercely, "Well, they do look it." "And some of them do want it," the Aes Sedai said. Her eyes over her shoulder were harder than Lan's for an instant. "But they want no part of what I am, and my presence protects you." Mat laughed uneasily, as if he thought it a joke on her part. Rand was not so sure. This was the Blight, after all. But trees don't move. Why would a tree grab a man, even if it could? We're imagining things, and she's just trying to keep us alert. Abruptly, he stared off to his left, into the forest. That tree, not 20 paces away, had trembled, and it was none of his imagination. He could not say what kind it was, or had been, so gnarled and tormented was its shape. As he watched, the tree suddenly whipped back and forth again, then bent down, flailing at the ground. Something screamed, shrill and piercing. The tree sprang back straight, its limbs entwined around a dark mass that writhed and spat and screamed. He swallowed hard and tried to edge Red away, but trees stood on every side and trembled. The bay rolled his eyes, whites showing all the way around. Rand found himself in a solid knot of horseflesh as everyone else tried to do the same as he. "Keep moving," Lan commanded, drawing his sword. The warder wore steel-backed gauntlets now,
and his grey-green scaled tunic. "Stay with Moraine Sedai." He pulled Mandab around, not toward the tree and its prey, but in the other direction. With his colour-shifting cloak, he was swallowed by the blight before the black stallion was out of sight. "Close," Moraine urged. She did not slow her white mare, but she motioned the others to huddle nearer to her. "Stay as close as you can." A roar sprang up from the direction the warder had gone. It beat at the air, and the trees quivered from it, and when it faded away, it seemed to echo still. Again the roar came, filled with rage and death. "Lan," Nynaeve said. "He—" The awful sound cut her off, but there was a new note in it. Fear. Abruptly it was gone. "Lan can look after himself," Moraine said. "Ride, Wisdom." From out of the trees the warder appeared, holding his sword well clear of himself and his mount. Black blood stained the blade, and steam rose from it. Carefully, Lan wiped the blade clean with a cloth he took from his saddlebags, examining the steel to make sure he had gotten every spot. When he dropped the cloth, it fell apart before it reached the ground, even the fragments dissolving. Silently, a massive body leaped out of the trees at them. The warder spun Mandab, but even as the warhorse reared, ready to strike with steel-shod hooves, Mat's arrow flashed, piercing the one eye in a head that seemed mostly mouth and teeth. Kicking and screaming, the thing fell, one bound short of them. Rand stared as they hurried past. Stiff hair, like long bristles, covered it, and it had too many legs, joining a body as big as a bear at odd angles. Some of them, at least those coming out of its back, had to be useless for walking, but the finger-long claws at their ends tore the earth in its death agony. "Good shooting, sheepherder." Lan's eyes had already forgotten what was dying behind them and were searching the forest. Moraine shook her head. "It should not have been willing to come so close to one who touches the true source." "Agomar said the blight stirs," Lan said. "Perhaps the blight also knows a web is forming in the pattern." "Hurry." Moraine dug her heels into Aldeeb's flanks. "We must get over the high passes quickly." But even as she spoke, the blight rose against them. Trees whipped in, reaching for them, not caring if Moraine touched the true source or not. Rand's sword was in his hand. He did not remember unsheathing it. He struck out again and again, the heron-marked blade slicing through corrupted limbs. Hungry branches jerked back severed, writhing stumps. He almost thought he heard them scream, but always more came, wriggling like snakes, attempting to snare his arms, his waist, his neck. Teeth bared in a Richter snarl, he sought the void, and found it in the stony, stubborn soil of the two rivers. "Manetheren!" He screamed back at the trees till his throat ached. The heron-marked steel flashed in the strengthless sunlight. "Manetheren! Manetheren!" Standing in his stirrups, Mat sent arrow after arrow flashing into the forest, striking at deformed shapes that snarled and gnashed uncounted teeth on the shafts that killed them, bit at the clawed forms fighting to get over them, to reach the mounted figures. Mat, too, was lost to the present. "Karan Kardazar!" he shouted as he drew fletchings to cheek and loosed. "Karai an Elisande! Al Elisande! Montero da Hain pas 20 Quebier! Al Elisande!" Perrin also stood in his stirrups, silent and grim. He had taken the lead, and his axe hewed a path through forest and foul flesh alike, whichever came before him. Flailing trees and howling things shied from the stocky axeman, shying as much from the fierce golden eyes as from the whistling axe. He forced his horse forward, step by determined step. Fireballs streaked from Moraine's hands, and where they struck, a writhing tree became a torch. A toothed shape, shrieked and beat with human hands, rent its own flaming flesh with fierce claws until it died. Again and again the warder took Mandab into the trees, his blade and gauntlets dripping with blood that bubbled and steamed. When he came back now, more often than not, there were gashes in his armor, bleeding gashes in his flesh, and his warhorse stumbled and bled too. Each time the Aes Sedai paused to lay her hands on the wounds, and when she took them away,
Only the blood was left on unmarked flesh. "I light signal fires for the half-men," she said bitterly. "Press on! Press on!" They made their way one slow pace at a time. If the trees had not struck into the mass of attacking flesh as much as at the humans, if the creatures, no two alike, had not fought the trees and one another as much as to reach them, Rand was sure they would have been overwhelmed. He was not certain it would not happen still. Then, a fluting cry arose behind them. Distant and thin, it cut through the snarling from the denizens of the Blight around them. In an instant, the snarling ceased, as if it had been sliced off with a knife. The attacking shapes froze. The trees went still. As suddenly as the things with legs had appeared, they melted away, vanishing into the twisted forest. The reedy shrill came again, like a cracked shepherd's pipes, and was answered in kind by a chorus, half a dozen, singing among themselves, far behind. "Worms," Lan said grimly, bringing a moan from Loyal. "They've given us a respite, if we have time to use it." His eyes were measuring the distance yet to the mountains. "Few things in the Blight will face a worm. Can it be avoided?" He dug his heels into Mandarb's flanks. "Ride!" The whole party plunged after him, through a Blight that suddenly seemed truly dead, except for the piping behind. "They were scared off by worms," Matt said incredulously. He was bouncing in his saddle, trying to sling his bow across his back. "A worm?" There was a sharp difference in the way the warder said it from the way Matt had. "Can kill a Fade, if the Fade hasn't the Dark One's own luck with it. We have an entire pack on our trail. Ride! Ride!" The dark peaks were closer now. An hour, Rand estimated at the pace the warder was setting. "Won't the worms follow us into the mountains?" Egwene asked breathlessly, and Lan gave a sharp laugh. "They won't. Worms are afraid of what lives in the high passes." Loyal moaned again. Rand wished the Ogier would stop doing that. He was well aware that Loyal knew more about the Blight than any of them except Lan, even if it was from reading books in the safety of a steading. But why does he have to keep reminding me that there's worse yet than we've seen? The Blight flowed past, weeds and grasses splashing rotten under galloping hooves. Trees of the kinds that had earlier attacked did not so much as twitch, even when they rode directly under the twisted branches. The mountains of doom filled the sky ahead, black and bleak, and almost near enough to touch, it seemed. The piping came both sharp and clear, and there were squishing sounds behind them, louder than the things crushed under hooves. Too loud, as if half-decayed trees were being crushed by huge bodies slithering over them. Too near. Rand looked over his shoulder. Back there, treetops whipped and went down like grass. The land began sloping upward, toward the mountains, tilting enough so that he knew they were climbing. "We are not going to make it," Lan announced. He did not slow Mandarb's gallop, but his sword was suddenly in his hand again. "Watch yourself in the high passes, Moraine, and you'll get through." "No, Lan!" Nynaeve called. "Be quiet, girl. Lan, even you cannot stop a worm pack. I will not have it. I will need you for the eye." "Arrows!" Matt called breathlessly. "The worms wouldn't even feel them!" the warder shouted. "They must be cut to pieces! Don't feel much but hunger. Sometimes fear." Clinging to his saddle with a death grip, Rand shrugged, trying to loosen the tightness in his shoulders. His whole chest felt tight until he could hardly breathe, and his skin stung in hot pinpricks. The Blight had turned to foothills. He could see the route they must climb once they reached the mountains, the twisting path and the high pass beyond, like an axe blow cleaving into the black stone. Light, what's up ahead that can scare what's behind? Light, help me, I've never been so afraid. I don't want to go any further. No further. Seeking the flame and the void, he railed at himself. "Fool! You frightened, cowardly fool! You can't stay here, and you can't go back. Are you going to leave Egwene to face it alone?" The void eluded him, forming, then shivering into 1,000 points of light, reforming and shattering again, each point burning into his bones until he quivered with the pain and thought he must burst open. "Light, help me! I can't go on! Light, help me!" He was gathering the bay's reins to turn back, to face the worms or anything rather than what lay ahead, when the nature of the land changed. Between one slope of a hill and the next, between crest and peak, the blight was gone. Green leaves covered peacefully spreading branches. Wildflowers made a carpet of bright patches in grasses stirred by a sweet spring breeze. Butterflies fluttered from blossom to blossom, with buzzing bees, and birds trilled their songs. Gaping, he galloped on until he suddenly realized that Moraine and Lan and Loyal had stopped. The others, too. Slowly, he drew rein, his face frozen in astonishment. Egwene's eyes were about to come out of her head, and Nynaeve's jaw had dropped. "We have reached safety," Moraine said. "This is the Green Man's place, and the Eye of the World is here. Nothing of the Blight can enter here." "I thought it was on the other side of the mountains," Rand mumbled. He could still see the peaks filling the northern horizon and the high passes. "You said it was always beyond the passes." "This place," said a deep voice from the trees, "is always where it is. All that changes is where those who need it are." A figure stepped out of the foliage. A man shape as much bigger than Loyal as the Ogier was bigger than Rand. A man shape of woven vines and leaves, green and growing. His hair was grass, flowing to his shoulders. His eyes, huge hazelnuts. His fingernails, acorns. Green leaves made his tunic and trousers, seamless bark his boots. Butterflies swirled around him, lighting on his fingers, his shoulders, his face. Only one thing spoiled the verdant perfection. A deep fissure ran up his cheek and temple across the top of his head, and in that the vines were brown and withered. "The Green Man," Egwene whispered, and the scarred face smiled. For a moment it seemed as if the birds sang louder. "Of course I am. Who else would be here?" The hazelnut eyes regarded Loyal. "It is good to see you, little brother. In the past, many of you came to visit me, but few of recent days." Loyal scrambled down from his big horse and bowed formally. "You honor me, Tree Brother. Singu machoshe ta'ingshen." Smiling, the Green Man put an arm around the Ogier's shoulders. Alongside Loyal, he looked like a man beside a boy. "There is no honoring, little brother. We will sing tree songs together and remember the great trees and the steading, and hold the longing at bay." He studied the others just now getting down from their horses, and his eyes lit on Perrin. "A wolf, brother. Do the old times truly walk again, then?" Rand stared at Perrin. For his part, Perrin turned his horse so it was between him and the Green Man, and bent to check the girth. Rand was sure he just wanted to avoid the Green Man's searching gaze. Suddenly, the Green Man spoke to Rand. "Strange clothes you wear, child of the dragon. Has the wheel turned so far? Do the people of the dragon return to the first covenant? But you wear a sword. That is neither now nor then." Rand had to work moisture in his mouth before he could speak. "I don't know what you're talking about." "What do you mean?" The green man touched the brown scar across his head. For a moment he seemed confused. "I cannot say. My memories are torn and often fleeting, and much of what remains is like leaves visited by caterpillars. Yet I am sure. No, it is gone. But you are welcome here. You, Moraine Sedai, are more than a surprise. When this place was made, it was made so that none could find it twice. How have you come here?" "Need," Moraine replied. "My need, the world's need. Most of all is the world's need. We have come to see the eye of the world." The green man sighed, the wind sighing through thick-leafed branches. "Then it has come again. That memory remains whole. The Dark One stirs. I have feared it. Every turning of years, the Blight strives harder to come inside. And this turn, the struggle to keep it out has been greater than ever since the beginning. Come, I will take you." Chapter 50. Meetings at the Eye. Leading the bay, Rand followed the green man with the other Emmons fielders, all staring as if they could not decide whether to look at the green man or the forest. The green man was a legend, of course, with stories told about him and the Tree of Life in front of every fireplace in the two rivers, and not just for the children. But after the Blight, the trees and flowers would have been a wonder of normality, even if the rest of the world was not still trapped in winter. Perrin hung a little to the rear. When Rand glanced back, the big, curly-haired youth looked as if he did not want to hear anything else the green man had to say. He could understand that. Child of the dragon. Warily, he watched the green man, walking ahead with Moraine and Lan, butterflies surrounding him in a cloud of yellows and reds. What did he mean? No, I don't want to know. Even so, his step felt lighter, his legs springier. The uneasiness still lay in his gut, churning his stomach, but the fear had become so diffuse it might as well be gone. He did not think he could expect more, not with the Blight half a mile away, even if Moraine was right about nothing from the Blight being able to enter here. The thousands of burning points piercing his bones had winked out at the very moment he came within the green man's domain, he was sure. It's him that winked them out, he thought. The green man and this place. Egwene felt it, and Nynaeve too, the soothing peace, the calm of beauty, he could tell. They wore small, serene smiles and brushed flowers with their fingers, pausing to smell and breathing deep. When the green man noticed, he said, "Flowers are meant to adorn. The plants or humans, it is much the same. None mind so long as you don't take too many." And he began plucking one from this plant and one from that, never more than two from any. Soon Nynaeve and Egwene wore caps of blossoms in their hair, pink wild rose and yellow bell and white morning star. The wisdom's braids seemed a garden of pink and white to her waist. Even Moraine received a pale garland of morning star on her brow, woven so deftly that the flowers still seemed to be growing. Rand was not sure they were not growing. The green man tended his forest garden as he walked, while he talked softly to Moraine, taking care of whatever needed care without really thinking about it. His hazelnut eyes caught a crooked limb on a climbing wild rose, forced into an awkward angle by the blossom-covered limb of an apple tree, and he paused, still talking, to run his hand along the bend. Rand was not sure if his eyes were playing tricks, or if thorns actually did bend out of the way so as not to prick those green fingers. When the towering shape of the green man moved on, the limb ran straight and true, spreading red petals among the white of apple blossoms. He bent to cup one huge hand around a tiny seed lying on a patch of pebbles, and when he straightened, a small shoot had roots through the rocks to good soil. All things must grow where they are according to the pattern, he explained over his shoulder, as if apologizing, and face the turning of the wheel. But the Creator will not mind if I give just a little help. Rand led Red around the chute, careful not to let the bay's hooves crush it. It did not seem right to destroy what the green man had done just to avoid an extra step. Egwene smiled at him, one of her secret smiles, and touched his arm. She was so pretty, with her unbound hair full of flowers, that he smiled back at her until she blushed and lowered her eyes. I will protect you, he thought. Whatever else happens, I will see you safe, I swear it. Into the heart of the spring forest the green man took them, to an arched opening in the side of a hill. It was a simple stone arch, tall and white, and on the keystone was a circle halved by a sinuous line, one half rough, the other smooth, the ancient symbol of Aes Sedai. The opening itself was shadowed. For a moment, everyone simply looked in silence. Then Moraine removed the garland from her hair and gently hung it on the limb of a sweetberry bush beside the arch. It was as if her movement restored speech. It's in there, Nynaeve asked. What we've come for? I'd really like to see the Tree of Life, Matt said, not taking his eyes off the halved circle above them. We can wait that long, can't we? The green man gave Rand an odd look, then shook his head. Avendasora is not here. I have not rested beneath its ungentle branches in 2,000 years. The Tree of Life is not why we came, Moraine said firmly. She gestured to the arch. In there is. I will not go in with you, the green man said. The butterflies around him swirled as if they shared some agitation. I was set to guard it long, long ago, but it makes me uneasy to come too close. I feel myself being unmade. My end is linked with it somehow. I remember the making of it, some of the making. Some. His hazelnut eyes stared, lost in memory, and he fingered his scar. It was the first days of the breaking of the world, when the joy of victory over the Dark One turned bitter with the knowledge that all might yet be shattered by the weight of the shadow. 100 of them made it, men and women together. The greatest Aes Sedai works were always done so, joining Saidin and Saidar, as the true source is joined. They died all to make it pure, while the world was torn around them. Knowing they would die, they charged me to guard it against the need to come. It was not what I was made for, but all was breaking apart, and they were alone, and I was all they had. It was not what I was made for, but I have kept the faith. He looked down at Moraine, nodding to himself. I have kept faith until it was needed, and now it ends. You have kept the faith better than most of us who gave you the charge, the Aes Sedai said. Perhaps it will not come as badly as you fear. The scarred, leafy head shook slowly from side to side. I know an ending when it comes, Aes Sedai. I will find another place to make things grow. Nut-brown eyes swept sadly over the green forest. Another place, perhaps. When you come out, I will see you again, if there is time. With that he strode away, trailing butterflies, becoming one with the forest more completely than Lan's cloak ever could. What did he mean? Mat demanded. If there's time. Come, Moraine said, and she stepped through the arch. Lan went at her heels. Rand was not sure what he expected when he followed. The hair stirred uneasily on his arms and rose on the back of his neck. But it was only a corridor, its polished walls rounded overhead like the arch, winding gently downward. There was headroom enough and to spare for Loyal. There would have been room enough for the Green Man. The smooth floor, slick to the eye like oiled slate, yet somehow gave a sure footing. Seamless white walls glittered with uncounted flecks in untold colors, giving a low, soft light even after the sunlit archway vanished around a curve behind. He was sure the light was no natural thing, but he sensed it was benign, too. Then why is your skin still crawling? Down they went, and down. There, Moraine said at last, pointing. Ahead, and the corridor opened into a vast domed space, the rough, living rock of its ceiling dotted with clumps of glowing crystals. Below it, a pool took up the entire cavern, except for the walkway around it, perhaps 5 paces wide. In the oval shape of an eye, the pool was lined about its rim with a low, flat edging of crystals that glowed with a duller yet fiercer light than those above. Its surface was as smooth as glass and as clear as the wine-spring water. Rand felt as if his eyes could penetrate it forever, but he could not see any bottom to it. The eye of the world, Moraine said softly beside him. As he looked around in wonder, he realized that the long years since the making, 3,000 of them, had worked their way while no one came. Not all the crystals in the dome glowed with the same intensity. Some were stronger, some weaker. Some flickered, and others were only faceted lumps to sparkle in a captured light. Had all shone, the dome would have been as bright as noonday, but they made it only late afternoon now. Dust coated the walkway and bits of stone and even crystal. Long years waiting, while the wheel turned and ground. But what is it? Mat asked uneasily. That doesn't look like any water I ever saw. He kicked a lump of dark stone the size of his fist over the edge. The stone struck the glassy surface and slid into the pool without a splash or so much as a ripple. As it sank, the rock began to swell, growing ever larger and more attenuated, a blob the size of his head that Rand could almost see through, a faint blur as wide as his arm was long. Then it was gone. He thought his skin would creep right off his body. What is it? He demanded, and was shocked at the hoarse harshness of his own voice. It might be called the essence of Saidin. The Aes Sedai's words echoed round the dome. The essence of the male half of the true source, the pure essence of the power wielded by men before the time of madness. The power to mend the seal on the Dark One's prison, or to break it open completely. The light shine on us and protect us, Nynaeve whispered. Egwene clutched her as if she wanted to hide behind the wisdom. Even Lan stirred uneasily, though there was no surprise in his eyes. Stone thudded into Rand's shoulders, and he realized he had backed as far as the wall, as far from the eye of the world as he could get. He would have pushed himself right through the wall if he could have. Mat, too, was splayed out against the stone as flat as he could make himself. Perrin was staring at the pool with his axe half drawn. His eyes shone, yellow and fierce.
I always wondered,
Loyal said uneasily.
When I read about it, I always wondered what it was. Why? Why did they do it? And how?
No one living knows. Moraine no longer looked at the pool. She was watching Rand and his two friends, studying them, her eyes weighing. Neither the how nor more of the why than that it would be needed one day, and that that need would be the greatest and most desperate the world had faced to that time. Perhaps ever would face. Many in Tar Valon have attempted to find a way to use this power, but it is as untouchable for any woman as the moon is for a cat. Only a man could channel it, but the last male Aes Sedai is nearly 3,000 years gone. Yet the need they saw was a desperate one. They worked through the taint of the Dark One on Saidin to make it, and make it pure, knowing that doing so would kill them all. Male Aes Sedai and female together. The Green Man spoke true. The greatest wonders of the Age of Legends were done in that way. Saidin and Saidar together. All the women in Tar Valon, all the Aes Sedai in all the courts and cities, even with those in the lands beyond the waste, even counting those who may still live beyond the Arith Ocean, could not fill a spoon with the power, lacking men to work with them. Rand's throat rasped as if he had been screaming. Why did you bring us here? Because you are ta'veren. The Aes Sedai's face was unreadable. Her eyes shimmered and seemed to pull at him. Because the Dark One's power will strike here, and because it must be confronted and stopped, or the shadow will cover the world. There is no need greater than that. Let us go out into the sunlight again, while there is yet time. Without waiting to see if they would follow, she started back up the corridor with Lan, who stepped perhaps a bit more quickly than usual for him. Egwene and Nynaeve hurried behind her. Rand edged along the wall. He could not make himself get even one step closer to what the pool was, and scrambled into the corridor in a tangle with Mat and Perrin. He would have run if it had not meant trampling Egwene and Nynaeve, Moraine and Lan. He could not stop shaking, even when he was back outside. I do not like this, Moraine, Nynaeve said angrily when the sun shone on them again. I believe the danger is as great as you say, or I would not be here, but this is... I have found you at last. Rand jerked as if a rope had tightened around his neck. The words, the voice. For a moment he believed it was Baalzamon. But the two men who walked out of the trees, faces hidden by their cowls, did not wear cloaks the color of dried blood. One cloak was a dark grey, the other almost as dark a green, and they seemed musty even in the open air. And the men were not Fades. The breeze stirred their cloaks. Who are you? Lan's stance was cautious, his hand on his sword hilt. How did you come here?
If you are seeking the Green Man,
he guided us. The hand that pointed to Matt was old and shriveled to scarcely human, lacking a fingernail and with knuckles gnarled like knots in a piece of rope. Matt took a step back, eyes widening. An old thing, an old friend, an old enemy. But he is not the one we seek. The green-cloaked man finished. The other man stood as if he would never speak. Moraine straightened to her full height, no more than shoulder-high to any man there, but suddenly seeming as tall as the hills. Her voice rang like a bell, demanding, "Who are you?" Hands pushed back hoods, and Rand goggled. The old man was older than old. He made Sen Bui look like a child in the bloom of health. The skin of his face was like crazed parchment drawn tight over a skull, then pulled tighter still. Wispy tufts of brittle hair stood at odd places on his scabrous scalp. His ears were withered bits like scraps of ancient leather. His eyes sunken, peering out of his head as if from the ends of tunnels. Yet the other was worse. A tight black leather carapace covered that one's head and face completely, but the front of it was worked into a perfect face, a young man's face, laughing wildly, laughing insanely, frozen forever. What is he hiding if the other shows what he shows? Then even thought froze in his head, shattered to dust, and blew away. "I am called Agenor," the old one said, "and he is Balthamel. He no longer speaks with his tongue. The wheel grinds exceedingly fine over 3,000 years imprisoned." His sunken eyes slid to the arch. Balthamel leaned forward, his mask's eyes on the white stone opening as if he wanted to go straight in. "So long without," Agenor said softly. "So long." "The light protect," Loyal began, his voice shaking, and cut off abruptly when Agenor looked at him. "The Forsaken," Matt said hoarsely, "are bound in Sheol-Gu." "Were bound." Agenor smiled. His yellowed teeth had the look of fangs. "Some of us are bound no longer. The seals weaken, Aes Sedai. Like Ishamael, we walk the world again, and soon the rest of us will come. I was too close to this world in my captivity, I and Balthamel, too close to the grinding of the wheel. But soon the great Lord of the Dark will be free and give us new flesh, and the world will be ours once more. You will have no Luz Therin Kinslayer this time, no Lord of the Morning to save you. We know the one we seek now, and there is no more need for the rest of you." Lan's sword sprang from its scabbard too fast for Rand's eye to follow. Yet the warder hesitated, eyes flickering to Moraine, to Nynaeve. The two women stood well apart. To put himself between either of them, and the Forsaken would put him further from the other. Only for a heartbeat the hesitation lasted, but as the warder's feet moved, Agenor raised his hand. It was a scornful gesture, a flipping of his gnarled fingers as if to shoo away a fly. The warder flew backwards through the air as though a huge fist had caught him. With a dull thud, Lan struck the stone arch, hanging there for an instant before dropping in a flaccid heap, his sword lying near his outstretched hand. "No!" Nynaeve screamed. "Be still," Moraine commanded, but before anyone else could move, the Wisdom's knife had left her belt, and she was running toward the Forsaken, her small blade upraised. "The light blind you!" she cried, striking at Agenor's chest. The other Forsaken moved like a viper. While her blow still fell, Balthamel's leather-cased hand darted out to seize her chin, fingers sinking into one cheek while thumb dug into the other, driving the blood out with their pressure and raising the flesh in pale ridges. A convulsion racked Nynaeve from head to toe as if she had been cracked like a whip. Her knife dropped uselessly from dangling fingers as Balthamel lifted her by his grip, brought her up to where the leather mask stared into her still quivering face. Her toes spasmed a foot above the ground. Flowers rained from her hair. "I have almost forgotten the pleasures of the flesh." Agenor's tongue crossed his withered lips, sounding like stone on rough leather. "But Balthamel remembers much." The laughter of the mask seemed to grow wilder, and the wail that left Nynaeve burned Rand's ears like despair ripped from her living heart. Suddenly, Egwene moved, and Rand saw that she was going to help Nynaeve. "Egwene, no!" he shouted, but she did not stop. His hand had gone to his sword at Nynaeve's cry, but now he abandoned it and threw himself at Egwene. He thudded into her before she took her third step, carrying them both to the ground. Egwene landed under him with a gasp, immediately thrashing to get free. Others were moving too, he realized. Perrin's axe whirled into his hands, and his eyes glowed golden and fierce. "Wisdom!" Mat howled, the dagger from Shadar Logoth in his fist. "No!" Rand called. "You can't fight the Forsaken!" But they ran past him as if they had not heard, their eyes on Nynaeve and the two Forsaken. Agenor glanced at them unconcernedly and smiled. Rand felt the air stir above him like the crack of a giant's whip. Mat and Perrin, not even halfway to the Forsaken, stopped as if they had run into a wall, bounced back to sprawl on the ground. "Good," Agenor said. "A fitting place for you. If you learn to abase yourself properly in worship of us, I might let you live." Hastily, Rand scrambled to his feet. Perhaps he could not fight the Forsaken. No ordinary human could, but he would not let them believe for a minute that he was groveling before them. He tried to help Egwene up, but she slapped his hands away and stood by herself, angrily brushing off her dress. Mat and Perrin had also stubbornly pushed themselves unsteadily erect. "You will learn," Agenor said, "if you want to live. Now that I have found what I need," his eyes went to the stone archway, "I may take the time to teach you." "This shall not be." The green man strode out of the trees with a voice like lightning striking an ancient oak. "You do not belong here." Agenor spared him a brief, contemptuous glance. "Begone! Your time is ended, all your kind, but you long since dust. Live what life is left to you, and be glad you are beneath our notice." "This is my place," the green man said, "and you shall hurt no living thing here." Balthamel tossed Nynaeve aside like a rag, and like a crumpled rag she fell, eyes staring, limp as if all her bones had melted. One leather-clad hand lifted, and the green man roared as smoke rose from the vines that wove him. The wind in the trees echoed his pain. Agenor turned back to Rand and the others, as if the green man had been dealt with. But one long stride and massive leafy arms wrapped themselves around Balthamel, raising him high, crushing him against a chest of thick creepers, black leather mask laughing into hazelnut eyes dark with anger. Like serpents, Balthamel's arms writhed free, his gloved hands grasping the green man's head as though he would wrench it off. Flames shot up where those hands touched, vines withering, leaves falling. The green man bellowed as thick, dark smoke poured out between the vines of his body. On and on he roared, as if all of him were coming out of his mouth with the smoke that billowed between his lips. Suddenly, Balthamel jerked in the green man's grasp. The Forsaken's hands tried to push him away instead of clutching him. One gloved hand flung wide, and a tiny creeper burst through the black leather. A fungus, such as rings trees in the deep shadows of the forest, ringed his arm, sprang from nowhere to full grown, swelling to cover the length of it. Balthamel thrashed, and a shoot of stinkweed ripped open his carapace. Lichens dug in their roots and split tiny cracks across the leather of his face. Nettles broke the eyes of his mask. Death's head mushrooms tore open the mouth. The green man threw the Forsaken down. Balthamel twisted and jerked as all the things that grew in the dark places, all the things with spores, all the things that loved the dank, swelled and grew, tore cloth and leather and flesh. Was it flesh, seen in that brief moment of verdant rage? To tattered shreds, and covered him until only a mound remained, indistinguishable from many in the shaded depths of the green forest. And the mound moved no more than they. With a groan, like a limb breaking under too great a weight, the green man crashed to the ground. Half his head was charred black. Tendrils of smoke still rose from him like grey creepers. Burned leaves fell from his arm as he painfully stretched out his blackened hand to gently cup an acorn. The earth rumbled as an oak seedling pushed up between his fingers. The green man's head fell, but the seedling reached for the sun, straining. Roots shot out and thickened, delved beneath the ground and rose again, thickened more as they sank. The trunk broadened and stretched upward, bark turning grey and fissured and ancient. Limbs spread and grew heavy, as big as arms, as big as men, and lifted to caress the sky, thick with green leaves, dense with acorns. The massive web of roots turned the earth like ploughs as it spread. The already huge trunk shivered, grew wider, round as a house. Stillness came, and an oak that could have stood 500 years covered the spot where the green man had been, marking the tomb of a legend. Nynaeve lay on the gnarled roots, grown curved to her shape, to make a bed for her to rest upon. The wind sighed through the oak's branches. It seemed to murmur farewell. Even Aginor seemed stunned. Then his head lifted, cavernous eyes burning with hate. Enough! It is past time to end this. Yes, Forsaken, Moraine said, her voice as cold as deep winter ice. Past time. The Aes Sedai's hand rose, and the ground fell away beneath Aginor's feet. Flame roared from the chasm, whipped to a frenzy by wind howling in from every direction, sucking a maelstrom of leaves into the fire, which seemed to solidify into a red-streaked yellow jelly of pure heat. In the middle of it, Aginor stood, his feet supported only by air. The Forsaken looked startled, but then he smiled and took a step forward. It was a slow step, as if the fire tried to root him to the spot, but he took it. And then another. Run! Moraine commanded. Her face was white with strain. All of you, run! Aginor stepped across the air toward the edge of the flames. Rand was aware of others moving, Mat and Perrin dashing away at the edge of his vision, Loyal's long legs carrying him into the trees, but all he could really see was Egwene. She stood there, rigid, face pale and eyes closed. It was not fear that held her, he realized. She was trying to throw her puny, untrained wielding of the power against the Forsaken. Roughly, he grabbed her arm and pulled her around to face him. "Run!" he shouted at her. Her eyes opened, staring at him, angry with him for interfering, liquid with hate for Aginor, with fear of the Forsaken. "Run!" he said, pushing her toward the trees hard enough to start her. "Run!" Once started, she did run. But Aginor's withered face turned toward him, toward the running Egwene behind him, as the Forsaken walked through the flames, as if what the Aes Sedai was doing did not concern Aginor at all. Toward Egwene. "Not her!" Rand shouted. "The light burn you! Not her!" He snatched up a rock and threw it, meaning to draw Aginor's attention. Halfway to the Forsaken's face, the stone turned to a handful of dust. He hesitated only a moment, long enough to glance over his shoulder and see that Egwene was hidden in the trees. The flames still surrounded Aginor, patches of his cloak smouldering, but he walked as if he had all the time in the world, and the fire's rim was near. Rand turned and ran. Behind him, he heard Moraine begin to scream. Chapter 51. Against the Shadow. The land tended upward the way Rand went, but fear lent his legs strength, and they ate ground in long strides, tearing his way through flowering bushes and tangles of wild rose, scattering petals, not caring if thorns ripped his clothes or even his flesh. Moraine had stopped screaming. It seemed as if the shrieks had gone on forever, each one more throat-wrenching than the last, but he knew they had lasted only moments altogether. Moments before Aginor would be on his trail. He knew it would be him that Aginor followed. He had seen the certainty in the Forsaken's hollow eyes, in that last second before terror whipped his feet to run. The land grew ever steeper, but he scrambled on, pulling himself forward by handfuls of undergrowth, rocks and dirt and leaves spilling down the slope from under his feet, finally crawling on hands and knees when the slant became too great. Ahead, above, it leveled out a little. Panting, he scrabbled his way the last few spans, got to his feet, and stopped, wanting to howl aloud. 10 paces in front of him, the hilltop dropped away sharply. He knew what he would see before he reached it, but he took the steps anyway, each heavier than the one before, hoping there might be some track, a goat path, anything. At the edge, he looked down a sheer 100-foot drop, a stone wall as smooth as planed timber. There has to be some way. I'll go back and find a way around. Go back and... When he turned, Aginor was there, just reaching the crest. The Forsaken topped the hill without any difficulty, walking up the steep slope as if it were level ground. Deep, sunken eyes burned at him from that drawn, parchment face. Somehow it seemed less withered than before, more fleshed, as if Aginor had fed well on something. Those eyes were fixed on him, yet when Aginor spoke, it was almost to himself. Ba'alzamon will give rewards beyond mortal dreaming for the one who brings you to Sheol Ghul. Yet my dreams have always been beyond those of other men, and I left mortality behind millennia ago. What difference if you serve the great Lord of the Dark alive or dead? None to the spread of the shadow. Why should I share power with you? Why should I bend knee to you, I, who faced Luz Therin Telamon in the Hall of the Servants itself? I, who threw my might against the Lord of the Morning and met him stroke for stroke? I think not. Rand's mouth dried like dust. His tongue felt as shriveled as Aginor. The edge of the precipice grated under his heels, stone falling away. He did not dare look back, but he heard the rocks bounding and rebounding from the sheer wall, just as his body would if he moved another inch. It was the first he knew that he had been backing up, away from the Forsaken. His skin crawled until he thought he must see it writhing if he looked, if he could only take his eyes off the Forsaken. There has to be some way to get away from him. Some way to escape. There has to be. Some way. Suddenly he felt something. Saw it, though he knew it was not there to see. A glowing rope ran off from Agenor, behind him. White, like sunlight seen through the purest cloud. Heavier than a blacksmith's arm, lighter than air, connecting the Forsaken to something distant beyond knowing, something within the touch of Rand's hand. The rope pulsed, and with every throb, Agenor grew stronger, more fully fleshed, a man as tall and strong as himself, a man harder than the warder, more deadly than the Blight. Yet beside that shining cord, the Forsaken seemed almost not to exist. The cord was all. It hummed. It sang. It called Rand's soul. One bright finger strand lifted away, drifted, touched him, and he gasped. Light filled him, and heat that should have burned, yet only warmed as if it took the chill of the grave from his bones. The strand thickened. I have to get away. No! Agenor shouted. You shall not have it! It is mine! Rand did not move, and neither did the Forsaken, yet they fought as surely as if they grappled in the dust. Sweat beaded on Agenor's face, no longer withered, no longer old, that of a strong man in his prime. Rand pulsed with the beating in the cord, like the heartbeat of the world. It filled his being. Light filled his mind, till only a corner was left for what was himself. He wrapped the void around that nook, sheltered in emptiness. Away! Mine! Agenor cried. Mine! Warmth built in Rand, the warmth of the sun, the radiance of the sun, bursting, the awful radiance of light, of the light. Away! Mine! Flames shot from Agenor's mouth, broke through his eyes like spears of fire, and he screamed, Away! And Rand was no longer on the hilltop. He quivered with the light that suffused him. His mind would not work. Light and heat blinded it. The light. In the midst of the void, the light blinded his mind, stunned him with awe. He stood in a broad mountain pass, surrounded by jagged black peaks like the teeth of the Dark One. It was real. He was there. He felt the rocks under his boots, the icy breeze on his face. Battle surrounded him, or the tail end of battle. Armored men on armored horses, shining steel dusty now, slashed and stabbed at snarling Trollocs, wielding spiked axes and scythe-like swords. Some men fought afoot, their horses down, and barded horses galloped through the fight with empty saddles. Fades moved among them all, night-black cloaks hanging still, however their dark mounts galloped, and wherever their light-eating swords swung, men died. Sound beat at Rand, beat at him, and bounced from the strangeness that had him by the throat. The clash of steel against steel, the panting and grunting of men and Trollocs striving, the screams of men and Trollocs dying. Over the din, banners waved in dust-filled air. The Black Hawk of Faldara, the White Heart of Shinar, others, and Trolloc banners. In just the little space around him, he saw the horned skull of the Dar-Vol, the blood-red trident of the Kokbal, the iron fist of the Daimon. Yet it was indeed the tail end of battle, a pausing, as humans and Trollocs alike fell back to regroup. None seemed to notice Rand as they paid a few last strokes and broke away, galloping or running in a stagger to the ends of the pass. Rand found himself facing the end of the pass where the humans were reforming, pennants stirring beneath gleaming lance points. Wounded men wavered in their saddles. Riderless horses reared and galloped. Plainly they could not stand another meeting, yet just as plainly they readied themselves for one final charge. Some of them saw him now. Men stood in their stirrups to point at him. Their shouts came to him as tiny piping. Staggering, he turned. The forces of the Dark One filled the other end of the pass, bristling black pikes and spear points swelling up onto mountain slopes made blacker still by the great mass of Trollocs that dwarfed the army of Shinar. Fades in hundreds rode across the front of the horde, the fierce, muzzled faces of Trollocs turning away in fear as they passed, huge bodies pulling back to make way. Overhead, Drag-Car wheeled on leathery pinions, shrieks challenging the wind. Halfmen saw him now, too, pointed, and Drag-Car spun and dove. 2, 3, 6 of them, crying shrilly as they plummeted toward him. He stared at them. Heat filled him, the burning heat of the touched sun. He could see the Drag-Car clearly, soulless eyes in pale men's faces on winged bodies that had nothing of humanity about them. Terrible heat. Crackling heat. From the clear sky, lightning came, each bolt crisp and sharp, searing his eyes, each bolt striking a winged black shape. Hunting cries became shrieks of death, and charred forms fell to leave the sky clean again. The heat. The terrible heat of the light. He fell to his knees. He thought he could hear his tears sizzling on his cheeks. No! He clutched at tufts of wiry grass for some hold on reality. The grass burst in flame. Please! No! The wind rose with his voice, howled with his voice, roared with his voice down the pass, whipping the flames to a wall of fire that sped away from him and toward the Trolloc host faster than a horse could run. Fire burned into the Trollocs, and the mountains trembled with their screams, screams almost as loud as the wind and his voice. It has to end! He beat at the ground with his fist, and the earth tolled like a gong. He bruised his hands on stony soil, and the earth trembled. Ripples ran through the ground ahead of him in ever-rising waves, waves of dirt and rock towering over Trollocs and Fades, breaking over them as the mountains shattered under their hooved feet. A boiling mass of flesh and rubble churned across the Trolloc army. What was left standing was still a mighty host, but now no more than twice the human army in numbers, and milling in fright and confusion. The wind died. The screams died. The earth was still. Dust and smoke swirled back down the pass to surround him. The light blinds you, Baalzamon! This has to end! It is not here. It was not Rand's thought, making his skull vibrate. I will take no part. Only the Chosen One can do what must be done, if he will. Where? He did not want to say it, but he could not stop himself. Where? The haze surrounding him parted, leaving a dome of clear, clean air 10 spans high, walled by billowing smoke and dust. Steps rose before him, each standing alone and unsupported, stretching up into the murk that obscured the sun. Not here. Through the mist, as from the far end of the earth, came a cry.
Blight wills it! The ground rumbled with the thunder of hooves as the forces of humankind launched their last charge. Within the void, his mind knew a moment of panic. The charging horsemen could not see him in the dust. Their charge would trample right over him. The greater part of him ignored the shaking ground as a petty thing beneath concern. Dull anger driving his feet, he mounted the first steps. It has to be ended. Darkness surrounded him. The utter blackness of total nothing. The steps were still there, hanging in the black, under and ahead. When he looked back, those behind were gone, faded away to nothing, into the nothingness around him. But the cord was yet there, stretching behind him, the glowing line dwindling and vanishing into the distance. It was not so thick as before, but it still pulsed, pumping strength into him, pumping life, filling him with the light. He climbed. It seemed forever that he climbed. Forever and minutes. Time stood still in nothingness. Time ran faster. He climbed until suddenly a door stood before him, its surface rough and splintered and old, a door well remembered. He touched it, and it burst to fragments. While they still fell, he stepped through, bits of shattered wood falling from his shoulders. The chamber, too, was as he remembered. The mad, striated sky beyond the balcony, the melted walls, the polished table, the terrible fireplace with its roaring, heatless flames. Some of those faces that made the fireplace, writhing in torment, shrieking in silence, tugged at his memory as if he knew them. But he held the void close, floated within himself in emptiness. He was alone. When he looked at the mirror on the wall, his face was there, as clear as if it was him. There is calm in the void. Yes, Ba'alzamon said from in front of the fireplace. I thought Aginor's greed would overcome him. But it makes no difference in the end. A long search, but ended now. You are here, and I know you. In the midst of the light, the void drifted, and in the midst of the void floated round. He reached for the soil of his home, and felt hard rock, unyielding and dry, stone without pity, where only the strong could survive, only those as hard as the mountains. I am tired of running. He could not believe his voice was so calm. Tired of you threatening my friends. I will run no more. Ba'alzamon had a cord too, he saw. A black cord, thicker by far than his own, so wide it should have dwarfed the human body, yet dwarfed by Ba'alzamon instead. Each pulse along that black vein ate light. You think it makes any difference whether you run or stay? The flames of Ba'alzamon's mouth laughed. The faces in the hearth wept at their master's mirth. You have fled from me many times, and each time I run you down and make you eat your pride with sniveling tears for spice. Many times you have stood and fought, then groveled in defeat, begging mercy. You have this choice, worm, and this choice only. Kneel at my feet and serve me well, and I will give you power above thrones. Or be Tar Valon's puppet fool and scream while you are ground into the dust of time.
Rand shifted, glancing back through the door as if seeking a way to escape. Let the Dark One think that. Beyond the doorway was still the black of nothing, split by the shining thread that ran from his body. And out there, Ba'alzamon's heavier cord ran as well, so black that it stood out in the dark as if against snow. The two cords beat like heart veins in countertime against each other, the light barely resisting the waves of dark. "There are other choices," Rand said. "The wheel weaves the pattern, not you. Every trap you've laid for me, I have escaped. I've escaped your Fades and Trollocs, escaped your dark friends. I tracked you here and destroyed your army on the way. You do not weave the pattern." Ba'alzamon's eyes roared like two furnaces. His lips did not move, but Rand thought he heard a curse screamed at Agenor. Then the fires died, and that ordinary human face smiled at him in a way that chilled even through the warmth of the light. "Other armies can be raised, fool. Armies you have not dreamed of will yet come. And you tracked me? You, slug under a rock, track me? I began the setting of your path the day you were born. A path to lead you to your grave, or here. Aiel allowed to flee and one to live, to speak the words that would echo down the years. Jane Farstrider, a hero. He twisted the word to a sneer. Whom I painted like a fool and sent to the Ogier, thinking he was free of me. The Black Aja, wriggling like worms on their bellies across the world to search you out. I pull the strings, and the Amalin seat dances and thinks she controls events. The void trembled. Hastily Rand firmed it again. He knows it all. He could have done. It could be the way he says. The light warmed the void. Doubt cried out and was stilled, till only the seed remained. He struggled, not knowing whether he wanted to bury the seed or make it grow. The void steadied, smaller than before, and he floated in calm. But Ba'alzamon seemed to notice nothing. It matters little if I have you alive or dead, except to you, and to what power you might have. You will serve me, or your soul will. But I would rather have you kneel to me alive than dead. A single fist of Trollocs sent to your village when I could have sent 1,000. One dark friend to face you where 100 could come on you asleep. And you, fool, you don't even know them all. Neither those ahead, nor those behind, nor those by your side. You are mine, have always been mine, my dog on a leash, and I brought you here to kneel to your master, or die, and let your soul kneel. I deny you. You have no power over me, and I will not kneel to you, alive or dead. Look, Ba'alzamon said. Look! Unwilling, Rand yet turned his head. Egwene stood there, and Nynaeve, pale and frightened with flowers in their hair. And another woman, little older than the Wisdom, grey-eyed and beautiful, clothed in a Two Rivers dress, bright blossoms embroidered round the neck. Mother, he breathed, and she smiled. A hopeless smile.
It's not real.
His mother's smile. No. My mother is dead, and the other two are safe, away from here. I deny you! Egwene and Nynaeve blurred, became wafting mist, dissipated. Kari Althor still stood there, her eyes big with fear. She, at least, Ba'alzamon said, is mine to do with as I will. Rand shook his head. I deny you. He had to force the words out. She is dead and safe from you in the light. His mother's lips trembled. Tears trickled down her cheeks. Each one burned him like acid. The Lord of the Grave is stronger than he once was, my son, she said. His reach is longer. The Father of Lies has a honeyed tongue for unwary souls. My son, my only darling son. I would spare you if I could, but he is my master now. His whim, the law of my existence. I can but obey him and grovel for his favor. Only you can free me. Please, my son, please help me. Help me. Help me. Please! The wail ripped out of her as bare-faced Fades, pale and eyeless, closed round. Her clothes ripped away in their bloodless hands, hands that wielded pincers and clamps and things that stung and burned and whipped against her naked flesh. Her scream would not end. Rand's scream echoed hers. The void boiled in his mind. His sword was in his hand. Not the heron-mark blade, but a blade of light. A blade of the light. Even as he raised it, a fiery white bolt shot from the point, as if the blade itself had reached out. It touched the nearest Fade, and blinding canescence filled the chamber, shining through the half-men like a candle through paper, burning through them, blinding his eyes to the scene. From the midst of the brilliance, he heard a whisper. Thank you, my son. The light. The blessed light. The flash faded, and he was alone in the chamber with Ba'alzamon. Ba'alzamon's eyes burned like the pit of doom, but he shied back from the sword as if it truly were the light itself. Fool! You will destroy yourself. You cannot wield it so. Not yet. Not until I teach you. It is ended, Rand said, and he swung the sword at Ba'alzamon's black cord. Ba'alzamon screamed as the sword fell, screamed till the stone walls trembled, and the endless howl redoubled as the blade of light severed the cord. The cut ends rebounded apart as if they had been under tension. The end, stretching into the nothingness outside, began to shrivel as it sprang away. The other whipped back into Ba'alzamon, hurling him against the fireplace. There was silent laughter in the soundless shrieks of the tortured faces. The walls shivered and cracked. The floor heaved, and chunks of stone crashed to the floor from the ceiling. As it all broke apart around him, Rand pointed the sword at Ba'alzamon's heart. It is ended! Light lanced from the blade, coruscating in a shower of fiery sparks like droplets of molten white metal. Wailing, Ba'alzamon threw up his arms in a vain effort to shield himself. Flames shrieked in his eyes, joining with other flames as the stone ignited. The stone of the cracking walls, the stone of the pitching floor, the stone showering from the ceiling. Rand felt the bright thread attached to him thinning, till only the glow itself remained. But he strained harder, not knowing what he did, or how, only that this had to be ended. It has to be ended. Fire filled the chamber, a solid flame. He could see Ba'alzamon withering like a leaf, hear him howling, feel the shrieks grating on his bones. The flame became pure white light, brighter than the sun. Then the last flicker of the thread was gone, and he was falling through endless black and Ba'alzamon's fading howl. Something struck him with tremendous force, turning him to jelly, and the jelly shook and screamed from the fire raging inside. The hungry cold, burning without end.